right, welcome to the Recharge Zone podcast. I'm your host, Brent Doty, and joining me today is our special co-host,
Ashley Aguilar.
This is not Ann Margaret, as you may have noticed. This is Ashley Aguilar. She is our intern. She's filling in for Ann Margaret today, who's out, but we hopefully will see her back on the next episode, and maybe she'll have a special message on this one at the end. But in the meantime, we have two very special guests today. Jewell Cozort. Hi, Jewell.
Hi, Brent.
And Casey Cowan. Hi, Casey.
Hello.
Casey and Jewell are biologists, ecologists, environmental scientists. What would you describe yourselves as most?
I would describe myself as a biologist and an ecologist.
And I've always described myself as a wildlife biologist, but I've done a lot on the ecology side because it's all kind of related.
I am super excited about this because it's a little out of my element. I'm a hydrogeologist. I usually only care about rocks, but more and more I'm realizing just how important the entire system is and how important biology is to the overall health of the aquifer. And that's kind of what we're talking about today, is how ecology and our environment relates to the hydrogeology relates to the aquifer. So Jewell and Casey both work for the Aquifer Sustainability Team. They work on conservation easements. They work at our field research park. And so today we're going to pick their brains a little bit about ecology. So Casey, let's start with you. First of all, we hear this term ecology a lot. You hear it on the news, you hear it, in media. What is ecology? What are we talking about?
Okay, so like the definition of ecology, and you break it down into the Greek definition, oikos means house or dwelling, and then ecology
Yeah.
means the study of.
Okay.
So it's the study of the house, basically, and so you could use that metaphor kind of to look at it on the landscape scale. So like in your house, you have all of these things, and you interact with those things, and it's like your relationship to the people in your house and how you use your water and your toaster and whatever. So if you just picture that on the landscape, animals, plants, water, sunlight, it's just the relationship and how everything works together in that biome or in that space.
Okay, so ecology examines how organisms interact with each other and the environment. So I'm assuming water is a big part of that.
Definitely. So there's different ways water interacts with an ecosystem in the way that it provides for organisms, how it moves things, right? So it can move soil and change the landscape, or it can cause it to change dramatically. Like in a drought period, you might see plants move or, die, and maybe there may not be as many, or animals move out of an area if there's not enough water. So water can change a whole landscape in both ways. And then, of course, there's like aquatic systems, oceans and rivers and creeks, ephemeral creeks where there's water sometimes and not others. So there's also, like, water is the basis of all life, right? We know that. It's movement, how it creates systems, how it provides a critical resource to living organisms.
Basically, it's everything.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Essential.
It's essential.
Mm-hmm.
And I never heard that metaphor with the house and the objects in the house and how the family interacts with all those objects. That makes a lot of sense.
It's easy kind of to picture it when you can relate it to yourself, and it's not just this, like, word.
Yeah, that's really neat. I want to focus in a little bit more on this concept of interacting with the water. Like you said, the water is essential for habitat and for growth and for the species. But let's talk specifically about, like, riparian health. So you mentioned rivers and ephemeral streams. We know in karst systems like the Edwards Aquifer that riparian areas are very important. That's the drainages and the creeks and the rivers are where most of the recharge happens. Mm-hmm. So I imagine that the riparian health has a lot to do with the water quality of the water going into that system, right? Jewell, can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yes, so as Casey mentioned, water movement on the landscape is a very powerful force, and riparian zones, we also call them buffers because they can buffer aquatic ecosystems from excess nutrients, pollutants, like herbicides and pesticides. But the biodiversity of riparian systems is also a great contributor to ecosystem health. You know, the biodiversity of the plants create higher up the food chain, more diverse animals like birds and reptiles. So specifically with vegetation along riparian or aquatic ecosystems, they provide shading that then reduces the water quality temperature that can influence the dissolved oxygen in the water, which can impact the macroinvertebrates. But most importantly, I think for the aquifer, they provide a buffer for erosion. If there's not enough vegetation and the biodiversity or the different types of vegetation along the riparian buffer are suffering, then erosion is going to be more predominant. And when huge undercutting of the riparian, the banks along the streams or lakes undercuts or erodes away, they call it bank failure. It can cause massive loads of sediment, increasing the total dissolved solids in the water, and that can reduce aquifer water quality.
Okay, so the plants play a huge role, sounds like, in both erosion prevention and that initial filtration. Now, we keep talking about this term biodiversity, and one can assume what that means, that, okay, biology and diverse, so it means many different types of plants. Is that basically what we're getting at here?
Yes, many different types of plants, different species, different genuses of plants, like trees, grasses, forbs, aquatic plants, all of the above.
And within that biodiverse ecosystem, what role do like the roots play? I mean, that must be, you're talking about root stabilization or stabilizing from that erosion. Is that a big deal?
That's the number one deal, yes. So thank you for bringing that up. That is how they hold the banks together. The roots stabilize the banks, and having a diverse plant community, you have roots of different depths. So the tree roots and other roots will go deeper, while grass roots, while they are also relatively deep to their size, they are dense and can form large clusters under the ground and hold the soil in place.
All right, this is a question for both of you guys. What does a healthy riparian area look like? What do we expect to see?
You'll have, like she mentioned, different types of plants, so trees, forbs, grasses, and they'll be of different age classes. So you won't have just
All one size.
yeah, or like all one age. Like for example, if you find go to Brackenridge Park, maybe you find that aesthetically people like to see trees limbed up with little to nothing underneath.
Yeah,
It's
very
like-
manicured.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's like this thing we like to look at, but it's not great for the environment. And then us, right, at the end result. But yeah, you want to see different age classes. You want it to be hard to walk through. You want it to be like you can't really see very far. And then, you know, that diversity will provide all of the different things and the niches that all these other wildlife need to survive.
Without the wildlife, you may have less seed dispersal, so the plants can't reproduce and move throughout the landscape. So not only is the vegetation important, but everything down from birds, which distribute seeds.
Yeah, even snakes have been documented to be seed dispersers now. That was like maybe 3 years ago. I saw a paper on that, that they noticed that the seeds of the rodents that they were eating were still in the stomachs.
Oh,
So they
I've
were
never heard of
acting
that.
as
Yeah.
seed dispersers. So you got to think outside the box and really open up your mind to what, like the importance of every player that's in that ecosystem.
yeah, right. Like every animal could potentially have an impact on the environment. We've been talking about plants this whole time, but the animals are equally as important.
Yes, and So we want that diverse grouping of plants, but one thing I'll also mention, because there are a lot of invasive species here in San Antonio, we want to, try and prohibit invasive species from entering riparian areas because they don't have competitors. They don't have pests that attack them and, reduce their populations. So before we end this podcast.
Because I think we all know how like goldfish end up in our natural streams as people dump their aquariums out. But how do these invasive riparian plants, how do things like that get in there?
Yeah, well, I think it started a long time ago. Like, all of a sudden, Nandina is very popular, right?
Yeah.
And so you
Or
buy
elephant
it.
ear.
Then your neighbor buys it, and then everyone's buying it, and then birds love to eat it, arguably. Like, it does provide food for birds. But then it finds its way into streams, and it floats down streams, and it becomes this aggressive plant that has no competitors and things that she mentioned. So mostly humans do that kind of introduction of invasive plants. And because they don't have the natural
There's no competition. Or
they become these monocultures.
they're competing for resources with native plants, and they sort of push them out of the way, or they take over the habitat that would normally be for a native plant that's more resilient, better adapted to our conditions, right?
Yeah, I actually did have a question about that. So, lots of HOAs in the area, they want you to have these pristine green grasses, but, how do things like that and non-invasive species in riparian areas impact our water quality as well as quantity? Because maybe they're not so drought resistant or, can't tolerate our climate.
Yeah, so that's got a long history too, with like grass being planted as an ornamental for an aesthetic. So that goes all the way back to like the time of kings and queens, and it was a symbol of nobility and that you had money to plant these monocultures of grass, and they'd keep them very short. And so unfortunately that's still kind of just carried on as an aesthetic that people like, although I do think that the tides are changing on that. But when you have a grass of Bermuda or of St. Augustine, it does take a lot more water. So you're having to use a lot more water. And plus, when you have monocultures like that, you're not providing biodiversity, and you're not going to have as many pollinators or invertebrates in that space. And it just goes up the food chain from there.
Okay.
And I don't know if I answered the question, though.
Well, I do want to
There was
add
a water quality
the
and
water
quantity
quality,
question.
the use of herbicides to remove pests or weeds from these lawns, and the uses of fertilizers to make the grass greener. These reduce water quality because they enter our
Right into the drains.
Yeah, and I feel like that even extends to our parks and to agriculture in the countryside as well, right?
Definitely.
Yeah. Parks across the country are still managed for an aesthetic and not necessarily for biodiversity.
But here in San Antonio, we have parks and we have natural areas, right?
Yep.
So certain parks are, yes, recreation is part of it, but their main focus is preservation, right? I want to change focus a little bit and talk about something caught my attention earlier. Talked about erosion, meaning erosion of the soil, but I know that soil is also critical to this whole thing. So Jewell, can you tell us about soil health and how that plays a role in this whole ecosystem?
Yes, I want to take a minute to talk about how underappreciated soil can be sometimes. I know that, for one, I have focused on it a lot more since being here at the Edwards Aquifer Authority, because it does play a crucial role in water quality. So I wanted to spit out a soil fact for everybody.
All right.
1 tablespoon of soil has more organisms in it than all people on Earth. Okay, and those are all made up of like bacteria and fungi. And the bacteria and fungi that are in soil are what we have used to find antibiotics for medicine. So soil is...
Go soil.
Yes, it's so important. It's like water kind of is so essential. Soil is also. It's the foundation of our ecosystems. It is the basis for all life. It provides a physical place and medium for plants to grow. So that's essential. You know, they put their roots down in the soil and they hold it in place. And the soil provides them with essential nutrients and water. So I also just want to remind everybody, plants, so not having them is very important. So we need the soil too, because that's what's going to give us plants. And then plants are, of course, the basis of the food chain. So without plants, we wouldn't have any small mammals or larger mammals that we eat and consume. So without soil, there would be no food.
And without plants and without the soil and the animals, there'd be no buffer for water quality of water going into the aquifer. That is the first line of defense.
Absolutely.
To filter out some of this runoff from storms.
Yes. So kind of talking about agricultural landscapes and land management, it's very important to have vegetation cover, because when the soil isn't covered, it's, you know, open to the elements. It's open to the force of rain and wind, and it can erode away. And without the plant cover, that strong physical force is going to push all of that soil towards aquatic systems that it's then going to enter the, you know, the aquifer and kind of cause sedimentation in the aquifer. All of that total dissolved solids and, you know, soil particles are going to settle down and can reduce the water quality.
And change the whole system, really. With enough sediment built up in a system, can change everything about it.
Yeah, it can act as fuel for bacteria. So, I mean, having a healthy riparian zone and healthy soil can help filtrate whatever you need before it actually gets into your recharge zone and then down into your aquifer. So that makes a lot of sense.
Yes, soil has also been described as a filter for even excess nutrients from agriculture that can cause algal blooms and things like that. Another thing I wanted to highlight about soil is the soil structure. And so not only is it important to keep the soil covered, but the structure of the soil, we want it to be loose and well aggregated. We do not want to compact the soil and make it so hard that water can't physically filter down into it. So reducing compaction, trying to limit compaction is very important for not only filtration but also erosion, because if the water hits the ground and then just streams over the land and towards the water bodies, it's going to pick up force and pick up all those soil particles and enter those systems.
And once it's compacted, it also makes it really difficult for plants to establish, right? So it's like this terrible cycle that you get in.
Yeah, so back in the 1920s and 30s, farmers were using large tillers to just till up entire sections of soil and upend it. I'm assuming they were doing that to cultivate the fields, obviously, but why did that work, or why did the Dust Bowl come into play with that?
Yeah, the lack of vegetation cover on the soil. Also, the depth of tillage can be detrimental. So today we're trying to move towards, you know, keeping cover crops on the ground in between crop rotations, and also tilling less deep, and it's called conservation tillage. And now there's even a term no tillage. Like, can we just get the agricultural products off the land without tilling it so deeply?
It's like turning your house upside down, right?
Yeah.
Everything drops out, and so organisms, these millions and billions and millions and billions of organisms, don't necessarily like being upended 8 or 10 inches from the ground, right?
Yes,
Right.
repeatedly over and over
Yeah.
again. Well, also one thing I wanted to highlight was the organic matter in soil. So if we're talking about water, we want to keep water in the soil, especially in Texas. You know, it's a precious resource here. So I wanted to hit y'all with another sort of
Facts. Coming in Harvard's facts. All right.
So for every 1% increase in soil organic matter, the soil is able to hold 20,000 gallons more water per acre of soil. So when we're talking about keeping the agricultural fields covered with cover crops, that's going to increase the organic matter because there's going to constantly be an input of dead plants and the like insects and things, beneficial insects into the soil. And so all of that organic matter is going to be cycling and promoting organic matter and therefore increasing the water holding capacity of the soil. And if we have more water, we use less water from the aquifer, and that's good for us here.
I like it. I like your facts, Jewell.
I do have a question. Like, what role can the average citizen or I play in supporting ecological system health in my respective community or anywhere around San Antonio, or even in the contributing artesian recharge zone?
Yeah. If you own a home and you have a yard, you could start by increasing your biodiversity there, right? Because even though it's a small footprint, if everybody did a little bit, then we could have a collective change. So you could increase your native plants in your front yard, reduce your lawn, which I'm sure most people have. Even I still have some lawn. So starting small, even with a small little pollinator garden, like a handful of plants. And then even if you don't have a house and maybe you have like a patio, you could pot some native plants that can provide food and shelter for insects. And I have some resources. There is a website called Seed Source. It's by Native American Seed, which some people may have heard of. You can find all sorts of native seeds there. And when you go to your local nursery, they have like Texas Superstars sometimes in the nursery. You can look for
Oh,
those.
I've seen those. Drought tolerant, resilient plants.
They're not always native, but just maybe educate yourself on the invasive species that are out there.
And the tags on the plants will identify them as native, right? You generally.
Yeah, most of the time there is a section for Texas natives, and there'll be like a little Texas symbol on them. Yeah, so you can do that. You could also, if you want to reduce, or if you still want to keep your lawn, which a lot of people like that aesthetic, there's also this really cool product that Douglas King Seed sells called Habiturf, and it's a blend of native grasses that don't get that tall.
Like buffalo grass or
Yeah, it's
zoysia?
buffalo grass and curly mesquite and blue grama. So you could play around with that idea if you're trying to keep some lawn. Of course, like if you have kids or pets and stuff, it's nice to have some lawn. But this would be an option that's native, provides that biodiversity, that doesn't use as much water, certainly doesn't need any pesticides. Yeah.
I feel like I would be remiss if I didn't plug the Education Outreach Center right now. There's a native Texas garden outside. There's also a couple of planters that have examples of native Texas grass. And also, if you have some time to go by and check it out, they have some seed packets from Native American Seed as well. So just wanted to throw that in there.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
perfect.
Thank you.
We love it there. You can also see Texas blind salamanders, so huge draw.
They're so cool. Their little hands.
Yeah. And so when I was thinking about this question, I wanted to add that I think getting involved in your community can be a really fun way to help our ecosystems and help biodiversity and water quality for the Edwards Aquifer. So getting out, you could visit the EOC, you could become a volunteer there, right? Or what I really enjoy doing is getting out and doing litter pickup. These are offered also all throughout, the year. I would also like to suggest, volunteering at a public park. The City of San Antonio natural areas have volunteer opportunities. The Comal Trails Alliance, because we do have some listeners maybe in the Comal County and other areas, they promote sustainable trails, which is going to help reduce erosion and adding that sediment to our aquifer. And then there's also the Ecological Research Group through the Meadows Center for Water and the Environment that they do invasive species removal along San Marcos River. So,
All right.
yes.
Well, Jewell, Casey, this has been very enlightening, and I'm really glad you're here to talk about it because ecology, biology, environmental systems, it's critical to the overall function of the aquifer. So I'm glad we got this side of the story from two experts in the field. Thank you so much for coming.
Thank you.
Yeah, and thank you for having me as a guest host.
Thanks, y'all, for tuning into this episode of the Recharge Zone podcast featuring Ashley Aguilar. Do you have questions, ideas for topics, or things you would like to share with us? Well, reach out to us by emailing us at rechargezone@edwardsaquifer.org. And stay tuned for more exciting episodes to charge up your knowledge on all things Edwards Aquifer.